feel like we're pretty much all back, aren't we? Yeah, Faye will be formally joining us at 11:30, but I just thought I'd take a few minutes to set some context. First of all, before we launch in this afternoon, I think everybody understands Pilla's going to be back after lunch and talking to you about the results that she found and that sort of thing. Any questions anybody has about anything, because we've got a few minutes, and then I'm going to give you some context about Gabriola. Okay, you've been coming to me pretty regularly one-on-one, so that's good. A reminder, on the first day here, we talked about a few people coming in late, and that the community keepers gatherings on Thursday and Friday mornings, that's tomorrow and Friday, would include some catch-up stuff from those of you who've been here. Thursday morning being content that I've been working with or process or whatever's important to you, and Friday being material that Ann Dale's been working with. So those of you who have been coming in late, and those of you who've been paying attention, that's a great opportunity for you to learn from each other and ask questions. Yes?
Can I make a suggestion? Because it looks like I have 3 times more from 8:30 to 9:30.
Oh, that's, yeah, so that's true. So when would you like to meet? Where for together?
We don't have a last one, I guess.
That's the poster session, isn't it?
Yeah, we wanted to meet in the third floor of the lounge area.
Okay, excellent, brilliant idea. At what time?
8:30.
8:30 in the lounge. Has everybody got that? That's what, the second floor one, or
I think it's the third floor.
The third floor. Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. Okay, everybody got that? That's a great idea. Thank you.
Where was the location again?
The third floor on the you know that lounge area kind of the third floor?
Okay.
Like
Yeah,
where
makes sense.
Yeah, for new people and then whoever has some curiosity here. You know, if you've been here and you've taken some notes,
And you can do your other community stuff too, of course, if you want to talk video or whatever's going on. Good. Okay. I think that was the only housekeeping item I had. So as Faye's organizing things in the background to come back on at 11:30 or earlier if we're ready, her session is a little bit different for a few reasons. It's more of a local community perspective on sustainability and change. The rest of the guests that I have coming in are sort of big picture folks and not local geographically for the most part. And also because this is a different format, she's going to tell us a few stories about work she's been doing and others have been doing. And then we have opportunities for questions. The way we've got the room organized now, I'll try to set up the mic so that when you come up to ask questions, just sort of stand to Kevin's right there, and you should be in a good spot for her to be able to see you clearly. And we've got the lights set up so that I think we can see her clearly as well. So she knows some of the initiatives I'm going to mention. It's not that Gabriola is, you know, the most famous or most spectacular example of sustainability and local action in the world. But, you know, I happen to know a bit more about it because I live there, and it's a very interesting place, as are most of the Gulf and San Juan islands off the coast here. So she's going to be speaking about a particular group of people, a particular organization, if you want to call it that, Sustainable Gabriola, and just picking a couple of the initiatives that they've been working on. And many of you have read about those already or seen Tracy's about them on the website. So, so these are a few things I'm going to mention here. Keep in mind this island has about 4,500 residents. So it's a small town, essentially, although it doesn't have that governance status. And the things I'm going to mention, PHC stands for People for a Healthy Community. It's an organization that works mostly with social justice issues. And to give you one of many, many, many examples of things that they've done, I don't know if this program's still going. We do have homeless people, you know, with the whole spectrum of homelessness on the island. And one of the things they've done is to have master gardening classes for these people to learn about organic gardening, develop those skills, and match them up with people who are generally speaking recent immigrants with money to the island who need help with gardening, want help with gardening, so that it ends up with a real win-win. And they do many other things as well, some of which are conventional things like food banks and so forth. They have soup socials that aren't anything to do with class or income. It's just people getting together with big pots of soup and sitting around and talking, but it does act as a sort of a food bank option for some of the people who come. There are lots of organic gardeners on the island. As a matter of fact, people would probably make strange faces if they saw someone using chemicals or chemical fertilizers and so forth. It's just the way gardening is done. There are 3 markets, 4,500 people, like 3 markets that go through the growing season, lots of roadside stands, lots of people helping each other through a gardening club and networking. Many experiments with alternate energy. It's not unusual to see a little windmill or solar panels, and there have been some bulk purchases of solar panels. Local abattoir, that might sound like an odd thing to put on the list, but the biggest local farmer was really concerned about stress to animals, not just from his farm, but from others, taking them, especially when the laws changed, and sometimes 2 ferry rides and silly things like that to take the animals to slaughter. And it was a big fight for him and his daughter to get that in place, but they did. So, that's made for more humane slaughter for the meat farmers on the island. There's a group of vegans who have a Facebook presence, link to all kinds of articles, put pressure on local restaurants. We're starting to see more vegan menu options in the local restaurants and more people experimenting with plant-based diets. So that's fun to watch. Some people consider it extreme, but it's not philosophically considered extreme on the island. It's pretty, a normal thing to consider. There's a theater. I mean, it's quite quaint and cute, and old red velvet seats, and often the films or videos they bring in, or performers or speakers they bring in, have a sustainability context to what they're doing. There's the Commons, which is an innovative initiative with common land of about 25 acres. Used to be a goat farm. It was taken over and is managed in a communal way, and at a practical level, like there's the whole governance piece, which is quite interesting, that at a practical level, there are garden plots, for example. There's a kitchen, a big commercial kitchen, so people can just come and use those things in a, like it's almost flipping Tragedy of the Commons, a lot of the stuff that's going on. Library, that doesn't sound like a big deal, but small island, 4,500 people. The library has the most use of any library in the system, which covers an area much larger than Gabriola. So people are in there ordering interlibrary books and working and talking, and it's quite intense. Gyro is a recycling facility that started off more or less as a free store, bring your stuff, come pick up stuff. It's had to evolve partly because of development on the island, and now there's a lot of recycling that has to be done with, building materials and things that cost money to get off the island. Hi, Faye, welcome back. I'm just finishing up my overview of Gabriola.
Okay.
Yeah, so, and if you can pull up I don't know if you can see yourself there, but if you can pull up a little bit closer.
Yeah, no, need to sit properly there. Okay.
So, Gyro has become more of a recycling facility, but there's also the store associated with it, and lots of people will take their clothing, their books, and so forth into the store to be sold to help raise money for the things that cost money there to run. There are also several Facebook and related groups with names like Free Cycle, with the express purpose of trying to keep things out of landfills. So, you constantly see, does anybody have any, 2x6s that, or I'm pulling carpet out of my house and it's in good shape, etc. And then on the bigger scale, although you'd never guess it when you drive around the island, New Society Publishers is on the island. And one of my friends has been an author there for years, and he thought he'd come over and go to the publishing house, and he was driving up and down Peterson Road trying to find a street sign or, a business sign. And he said, you just drive through the woods and there are these yurts and they're, it's amazing because they're really trying to live their principles and history, which come out of the Quaker movement in the States and, activism for things like sustainable development and low imprint lifestyle. So that's the bigger context of what's going on. And Faye's been a key person in, I think, probably several of these initiatives as a user, as an advocate. And she actually, it's interesting. My first contact with with Faye indirectly was with BC government, and you don't generally think of BC government as being an activist kind of a place. But after being a senior public servant there, she now thinks of herself as a community activist. That's her identity. And Faye's also the co-author of an upcoming book that's entitled Changemakers, Embracing Hope, Taking Action, and Transforming the World, which is a rather nice fit for our conversations here this week so far. And it's based on her doctoral research into the how of transformative change. So again, fitting with some of the comments from Steve Grundy and others that you've had. And before moving to Gabriola Island, she was at a senior level within BC government, and you worked with green topics, as I recall, in part of your work there.
Yeah, I worked at the Green Economy Secretariat, where we tried to initiate change across all different ministries and so on.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah. Okay, so welcome, Faye. Let's give her a round of welcome. I'm going to turn the camera around so you can see a bit of where you are here, Faye. And when you're through sharing your perspectives.
That was great to get the wave. Thank you.
People will probably come up closer where you can see them to ask questions at the microphone. So over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for having me. I understand a number of you have taken a look at the Sustainable Gabriola website, kind of as a reading. I think what I'd like to do today is talk kind of about some broader concepts around sustainability, and then use both Sustainable Gabriola and some of the other initiatives that Alice mentioned to kind of talk through some of those different concepts around sustainability in community. And maybe if I could just get a sense from you guys, how many of you are doing active work in your community with respect to sustainability? Can I see hands, or are most of you doing it at work? Yeah, I'm seeing some. Okay, cool. Okay, as we go through, if you can think about some of the work that you're doing and how it might relate to some of these concepts, and maybe we could have a conversation later on in the hour. So how I'm going to kind of frame sustainability and community is in three different ways to start with. The first one is nets and network. The second is transformative spaces, in which there are numerous different stories within a space. And the third is a quote from Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." So I'm going to start with the nets. So I want you to create a picture in your head. I want you to imagine threads linking you to all of the direct connections that you have to other people and to the earth. One thread could represent your next door neighbor. Another could represent the relationship between you and the food you had for breakfast. Still others could represent each of the people gathered around you, and another the air that you're breathing. And then imagine all of those threads linking to their connections. The thread to the breakfast food eventually linking to the soil that produced it and to the farmers. The threads connecting you to your neighbor are now linked through them to others in their life. Okay, do you have an image in your head? A myriad of threads, kind of a three-dimensional weaving. So if we move, what happens to those threads? They impact those that are at the other end of the thread, and their threads then impact others. So if our actions are based on personal gain, kind of the economic the economic animal described by traditional economists, then those at the other end of the thread experience the result, and that travels through the various threads. If we take action based on values of interconnectivity, of sustainability, and of compassion, then that also spreads through the web in its own way. So I think when people start to understand that those threads are there, then they start to look at the way in which they're doing things in a different way. I had a friend of mine that's in the community that started something called Lulu's Locals that was she initiated in our grocery store. She said she started realizing that when she was putting her hand out for the honey on the shelf, she could make a choice between the one that was local or the one that was mass produced with pesticides, etc. And one might have cost a bit more than the other, but she was realizing there was links back to the farmers, back to the food that we all eat, the farmers that were producing that, the bees themselves, and the health of the bees. And we all know there's problems these days with the health of bees. I'm realizing I'm leaning down, so my hair is falling forward. So I think with respect to this weaving, it's really a living net. And what groups like Sustainable Gabriola have done is call themselves a network, a net, rather than an organization. And that way it reflects the way in which sustainability kind of spreads throughout a community. When Alice was talking about all those different initiatives, there's all these interconnections between those different initiatives that are again part of that same idea of the threads pulling. So as one group initiates something, then it can trigger doing something in another organization. When the bus is running the bus and then someone gives a donation for people that don't have much money, then the local People for a Healthy Community, which provides supports for people that are living in poverty, come up to the plate and work with the bus to try to make things happen. So again, it's all of those links and it's a net rather than kind of a hierarchy. One of the things that can happen, and I think it can happen in all kinds of different places, it's definitely happened on Gabriola, where sometimes there are people that would like to have more power. They would like to be able to establish their own domain. So rather than working in a network kind of way, they start to create silos and us and them. And when that happens, the energy towards creating sustainability in the community kind of gets put on hold in those places. The energy that could be going towards sustainable initiatives instead is going towards kind of a territorial kind of battle and us against them. So one of the things that has happened on Gabriola to address those kinds of things happening, because it has happened with a number of the groups, is the idea of sitting down and actually having conversations about how do we move forward. So one of the groups, the Recycling Depot, which is a really innovative, amazing group, a few years ago, there was a real conflict around do they pay staff or do they have volunteers? And a number of people in the community got quite up in arms about it. And what we did was we ended up having a community group and invited the community to a conversation about how do we take a look at all of these different goals that the Gabriola Recycling Depot has, and how do we move towards that? Given that there's a conflict, how do we actually think about volunteers? How do we think about paid staff? And so in many ways, what was happening was we were moving it away from the us against them, and we were moving it back towards the idea of interconnectivity. I think the concept of having conversations in which you're looking at positive ways of moving forward is something similar to the second area that I wanted to kind of touch on. And that is the idea of transformative spaces. So I want all of you to think about whether or not you can think of a time that you were with someone, with a group, and all of a sudden some way in which you had perceived the world, way in which you'd perceived yourself, um, changed because you heard a different story. Um, can anyone think about whether or not that's happened to them? Can I see nods or anything? Yeah, okay, good, thank you. Okay, we're going to actually speak to some of those after I finish this introduction, because I'd like to get your take on, actually, even if one of you can now kind of speak to, can you think of what was going on? What was the thing that you shifted your way of thinking? Why don't you think about it and we'll come back to it? I'm trying to see whether or not there's anyone kind of putting their hand up, but I don't see it yet. So this second part, the transformative spaces, is another way in which sustainability happens in community, because many of us grew up with certain ways of being in the world. I know I learned that I needed to buy the least expensive thing rather than go for the expensive things. There's many different beliefs and rules that we grew up with. The idea that we need to have economic growth. Is that really the case? Is there another way to think about economics that isn't about economic growth? So there's this way of seeing things in a different way can actually shift then in the community ways in which we can start to move towards a more sustainable way of living. When we were taking a look at starting the bus up, there was the BC Transit told us that because there were so many baby boomers that live on Gabriola, then they would never get out of their car, because that's not what has happened elsewhere. The baby boomers like their cars and they're going to stay in them. And we said, well, maybe there's a different value that could be happening with some of the baby boomers on Gabriola. And when we put the bus on the road, the BC Transit was shocked to find that actually the way that they had perceived baby boomers may not have been the case with everyone. So I think sometimes the different story needs to actually be done before people start to understand that it can be real. Okay. The third one, and then what I'd like you to do as I'm talking about these different ways is to start to think about, again, your own work, and think about where it clicks in with some of the concepts that I'm coming forward with. So the third one was the quote that I read out loud about from Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." I think there is a sense, I know in government, when I worked in government, and maybe some of you in the work that you're doing, there is a belief that it is government or it is big powers that actually are the things that change the world. And yet, when you look back through history and you look back into, and we can start taking a look at some of the initiatives that we're talking about on Gabriola, as well as in other communities where it starts somewhere by a small group of people, and then someone else hears about it, and that living net that we were talking about earlier kicks into place, and you end up starting to have that same initiative kind of spread and spread. I think organic food and local food, probably 15 years ago, you would not have found the local food in a restaurant in the same way that you do now. There is a way in which these ideas that are initiated by small groups of people start to spread and spread and spread through the living net. And when we work within, so Sustainable Gabriola, I'm going to go back to that just to use it as an example of how things can move in that way. So it's a group and it's a network of individuals and people, and everyone is welcome. When people come, whoever wants to be the facilitator, we ask who wants to be facilitator that time. Someone does that. There's no hierarchy in it. And people bring ideas. There was one woman that was quite passionate about the idea of cooperatives, and so she brought that idea to the meeting and said she wanted to initiate a number of first of all workshops, but also trying some groups that want to be co-ops to try to support them in becoming co-ops. So she brought that to the group. Several other people said, I'm really interested in doing that. So now there's a group of 4 or 5 people that are working towards having a first big meeting in the community, a public meeting where we're going to be bringing in the BC co-op executive, and she's going to talk a bit about co-ops. And from there, we're hoping to move into creating a number of co-ops. So again, it's bringing an idea that has happened elsewhere. In the case of the co-ops, there's co-ops around the world. Is my voice echoing? No, it's okay. I'm hearing it echoing a bit. So, okay, so I think what happens when people bring those ideas to a meeting like Sustainable Gabriola or other groups, then people get passionate and they get excited and they start to move forward, and then things change. So all of that list that Alice has up on the board, the list that you saw on the Sustainable Gabriola website, many more other initiatives, those are things because a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens decided that they wanted to take action. Okay, I want to kind of close off the introduction here by opening it up to some questions around what I've said so far, and maybe even if you can start to give examples of how you've experienced some of these concepts yourself. Any questions?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. There's too many things going on. Nice to meet you. Thanks for coming in. My name is Marika, and I run a small nonprofit that has a lot of similar values to Sustainable Gabriola
Cool.
here in the area. And so it was a pleasure to read them. And my question is to do with the recycling depot,
Okay.
and why there was a reluctance to pay the people instead of having them, wanting to have them as volunteers versus sort of paid staff, because we run across that a lot in our initiatives where certain people feel it should just all fall on the shoulders of volunteers instead of being compensated.
Yeah, and I think it's a real struggle around trying to make that decision. I know the Commons, which I don't know if Alice mentioned it, is also going through the same questions. And I think it is the reason people don't want to pay. I know that in this particular case, it was a belief that somehow when you brought money into the equation, then that somehow negated what you were doing. And others said, but we need, this is a positive thing. And they were making money because of the way in which the recycling depot worked. And so they could actually pay people. And there also in the community, there's a need for work especially for younger people, in order to attract younger people. But I think the belief behind it was that somehow it would turn into that the people that got paid would start to take ownership, and that it might mean that others that were the volunteers were not valued as much, and that they then came under a hierarchy with the people that were paid on top, and those people deciding things as opposed to the volunteers. So I think those were all of the different dynamics that were going on.
Okay, and sorry, are they paid now?
They have, I believe, 3 people paid and a lot of volunteers. But what they did do, one of the things that came out of the forum and the discussion, was the need to honor the volunteers in a much bigger way, and to ensure that the volunteers had a big say in what was going on, and that it was more of a team approach as opposed to those that were paid making the decisions.
And one other quick question to follow up. Do you think that structure is working?
It seems to be working really well now, and I have to say one of the reasons is probably because of some of the people that they did hire, because those people know how to respect and work with volunteers. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Hi, Faith. My name is
Hi.
Carrie.
Hi, Carrie.
It is a question in regards to, I'm going to just use the swear word of pesticides in this case because it's a very scary
Okay.
word for most people. But it touches on an agriculture background for me, and the background is actually some research that I got to sit in on, and it was looking at these beehives for local honey producers, and these hives were actually situated near fields to help increase the pollination. So it was really a interconnected web and placement on that. And what had happened is there was a mite that carried a disease that would wipe out entire hives. And so there was an integrated approach to controlling this, not only on a pathogen side, but also on an insect side. And so they used an integrated approach with chemical to try to eliminate the complete death that resulted from these mites moving into a hive. And the question that I have is that, like, is there a recognition of the importance of an integrated approach to mitigating any of these pathogen or insect issues should they happen on the island?
Oh, so I'm probably not the best person to ask because I know there are other people that are much more engaged in that. But there are a lot of people on the island that are very strong permaculture farmers. And what would tend to happen is if there were problems like that, then there would be conversations with the people who have a fair bit of knowledge and understanding about how to use the natural world in order to, to reduce the mites or to reduce that. So there's, my understanding is that the issues around bees are much larger than mites too, aren't they? It's a challenge, I think, these days for people who are keeping bees. But I think that's the tendency, is to actually consult with others who've actually got a lot of knowledge. We have one organic farmer on the island that was involved in a cooperative out in a large cooperative out in the Chilliwack area, and he's kind of often a go-to person for people who are trying to understand what to do about that. But the specifics, I'm not the best person to ask on that.
Well, thank you.
Okay, thanks for your question.
Come on over.
Hi, Faye. I'm Colleen.
Hi, Colleen.
And I live on Quadra Island, so
Oh, cool.
Gabriella,
Yeah.
and the 3,500 residents.
Yeah.
And we're just in this past year started a village visioning process.
Oh, cool.
So you're probably well ahead of us, and we want the commons, and we want the industrial kitchen, and we want the recycling center.
Cool.
I think you can appreciate how diverse the opinions are on
Yes.
the island. And we have one of our problems is again attracting younger families back to the island. So we're finding the conversation keeps getting stopped between the retirees who want no development and the small group of people who want to, build a village that will attract young families with, IT backgrounds or jobs and things like that they can do on an island. Do you have any advice for moving that conversation forward in a positive manner?
Oh, Alice, jump in here, please. That is one of the biggest kind of challenges, I think, but I think what the village visioning process managed to do was get a lot more people that had been against any development starting to understand the need for sustainable affordable housing of some kind. And I've noticed, and again, I think sometimes it's about time, and it's about having the conversations, and then 5 years later, some of those people were voraciously against having any kind of affordable housing or sustainable affordable housing in some way are now starting to talk about the need for that. So I think if anything, it takes time, and it takes reasoned conversation, not kind of public meetings where the battle is out. But what it takes is small kind of what the Village Visioning did was bring in a number of people who talked about different options in other communities. And I think one of the other things we found was that most people on Gabriola would rather hear from other islands that were similar to themselves rather than hear from the big city people. And I'm sure that it's similar on Quadra. Yeah.
It is, yeah, and I think the mistake we made was one of the first visioning processes brought people in from away and not from, like you said,
Right.
the community. Did you move on affordable housing? And do you have a plan that way? Have you gone to smaller lot sizes? Or?
We haven't gone with smaller lot sizes, but there is a two-phase process that the Islands Trust is putting into place right now with respect to having more. So they've got on the 5-acre properties, there's now more options for having secondaries. There's actually options for having secondary suites, which 8 years ago would never have flown, but now that's starting to happen, and they're taking a look at what they can do closer to the village area to have some small homes, I guess would be the way to put it. I think that seems to be something people are really enthusiastic about. Yeah, that's interesting that you started. Yeah. It's interesting that you started with people from away, because I think we always think that the experts are away, and yet often they are right within our own communities. So.
So formulate my question. Hi, Faye, I'm Norma.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you.
I was wondering, maybe I have to start by asking you, do you know like the flow of people approximately on Gabriel? Is the population growing? Is it seasonal? Are people coming and going as much?
We actually have remained almost the same population for the last 2 censuses period. We had a real bulge 10 years ago. There was a 15% increase, and then it's remained the same, but there's tons of building on the island right now. So a lot of the lots that were previously had no building. I think we're also, as far as permanent residents, more and more people are making Gabriola their home rather than being seasonal.
Because my question is, so I live in Surrey, BC, and we're one of the
yeah.
fastest growing gigantic cities. There's 1,000 people coming to Surrey each month.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of opportunity in that as well. And I think the city and the people are quite engaged. But my question is still like, what's the applicability? What could we still learn from what Gabriel is doing in terms of in a setting that's first of all much bigger as is, and then is growing so much. What could we learn from you now and implement early before? What do you think the applicability is for my situation or our situation?
I think some of the same principles apply. Sorry, go ahead.
One more things to add. So the reason I'm asking is I don't work for the city, but I do sit on the sustainable committee for the city of Surrey. So do advise council on things. So the more I kind of learn, the more I can, kind of bring to city council. So I'm kind of interested in what other people are doing and how it's applicable to the city of Surrey.
Right. I think in some ways, it needs to be, you need to think back to the idea of there's a whole pile of neighborhoods in Surrey, and really the sense of being able to kind of move forward on things can happen much easier if you don't. Surrey is also a whole pile of neighborhoods that are linked, and they're all very different too. And I think it's really worthwhile to open it up to have the same kind of visioning and the concept of net that we used on Gabriola to actually do it within a manageable kind of group. You know, as soon as you go too big, then you end up losing people, or you end up just having a small group of people that end up being part of what's going on and others don't know or aren't part of it. But I think if you can really focus much more on getting people to participate, and they will do that much more if they feel that they're part of a neighborhood than part of the large Surrey. Yeah, I have a sister who lives in Surrey, her and her family, and it definitely, where they live, feels very much like a small community. They live in the Sullivan place. I'm going to get the name wrong, but I think that they see themselves as a community in and of themselves, and I think the more that you can build on that while linking, like, you know, linking Quadra and Gabriola, same as linking all of these different communities in Surrey across. So hopefully that
Yes.
might be the approach. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Hi there.
Kevin.
Hi,
Just
Kevin.
continuing from Norma's point, leading on Surrey, do you think that there's, what would your sense of a critical mass be in order to move forward? It's such a large community. Do you have a sense
Yeah, go ahead.
do you have a sense of what that would look like?
I think you need, it's getting back to the idea that often things start small and then grow. And so when you've got a large community and you've got a lot of different neighborhoods, I think it's about finding people with passion in those neighborhoods to start initiating things, and then finding ways to link what they're doing with other groups. Because I think in Surrey there are little pockets where things are quite exciting, right? There's some cool initiatives going on, and it's about how do you engage other neighborhoods to do similar things. And that, you know, it could be it could be about, I think it was down in Victoria that they did the pole painting or something in Fernwood. And so people see that, and then, I mean, up on Gabriola, someone saw it down in Fernwood and they said, let's do pole painting up here. So I think it's also about kind of taking those kinds of things that people are working on already in community and trying to share them with other neighborhoods to see whether or not the links can start to happen.
Through a feedback process, right? Okay.
What's that? Okay.
Feedback process.
Okay.
Hi, Faye.
Hi.
Allison. First of all, thanks very much for taking the time to speak with us today.
You're welcome.
It's really interesting to hear the techniques that Gabriola has used and how the community has come together to make collaborative decisions. So I guess my question is, do you, in your experience and in your beliefs, do you think that there are situations in which top-down governance is preferred, or do you think that collective, non-hierarchical decision-making is always preferred?
That's a great question. My preference is that it always be non-hierarchical, collaborative. I know that there's a number of people that I work with that might have a different opinion. I think one of the things that when we started up the Gertie the bus system, we did it and based on the non-hierarchical, we all take responsibility and we all have different roles that we agree to take on, but we don't act in a hierarchical way. And there were two of the people that were part of it said, fine, we'll go with your experiment for a while, but we don't actually believe it will work because we think there needs to be spokespeople, we think there needs to be someone in charge to be able to direct people and so on. So we've now been running for probably the board's been in place for about 6 years. And we just had a recent annual general meeting, and someone that came on the board, she said, I have never seen a more positive board. Like, everyone's laughing, everyone feels part of it, there's a really good feeling there. So the same kind of thing with Sustainable Gabriola. There is no sense of power struggles. The the bookkeeper that we use attends a number of different meetings, and she says the difference with some of the other boards are all kind of fighting for power and fighting for who's going to be in charge. And so the extent to which that doesn't happen in Gertie or in in Sustainable Gabriola seems to work really effectively. So I know that there are groups, there are boards that do have a hierarchical model and do work, but my experience so far has been that this works really in a very positive way. Do you have any kind of thoughts yourself around that?
No, I would say that I haven't formed a conclusive decision. And it kind of goes back and forth. And I've seen models that have worked very well with top-down governance, but I've also seen models that have worked with more of a collaborative approach. And so I was just you have more experience than I do in that area, so I was just wondering your opinion.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot has to do with the people involved, doesn't it? And whether or not their interest is in actually working towards the goal of the organization, or whether it is really about kind of making a name for themselves or whatever. So I think that plays into my earbuds coming out. That also plays into decision making around who then becomes part of a particular board. I think one of the things I've been a little shocked about is that the Sustainable Gabriola one works so well because everyone's welcome, and kind of choosing someone that has that same philosophy. Instead, people that come seem to respect that because the culture's there. So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome.
Hey there, I'm Matt. Thanks again for coming.
Hi, Matt. Yeah.
I have a theoretical question for you.
Okay.
Obviously, you're relatively close to the Big Island. If there was a bridge put out to Gabriola, what sort of framework would you establish to preserve like the core values of sustainability, I guess? Or your core values?
Fortunately, there's not going to be a bridge. There's been studies done on looking at the option. I think it was first raised back by Pat McGeer probably 30 years ago because it was a very obvious link. So it's a good question. I think that what would happen would be that we've got Islands Trust as our local government, and that determines kind of land use planning. That's their prime responsibility. And because there is a culture on the island that wants it to be more sustainable, there are a number of people that would be very strong in their advocacy to make sure that the way in which the land use planning for the island was maintained. For example, things like making sure there's no McDonald's that go up, right? I mean, everything needs to be locally owned. There's a lot of those ways in which both the Islands Trust and the community itself can kind of advocate to ensure that sustainability, the way in which we think and so on, is maintained as much as possible. I do think it would potentially have a negative impact because as soon as you put a bridge up, what you're talking about is cars, and then it's not as easy to kind of I mean, the bus is perfect, it brings people to a ferry, people get on the ferry, there's a sense of community that occurs while people are on the ferry that you would lose. So I think that's one of the dangers. We would do it, but I think we would have to really work hard at making it happen.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Fanny.
Hello.
My name's Charles.
Hi, Charles.
Hey. I have a question. You mentioned that one of the strategies was when people are able to pull on those strings and gain some power and focus on improving themselves. I was wondering, and you said you got them to come to the table and have conversations about how to move forward. I was wondering what sort of strategies you guys use to get people to agree to come to the table, and what sort of strategies and what sort of things you talk about once they're there to move in a positive direction.
Okay, so it wasn't that hard actually to get people to come to the table because it was the whole community. So we basically just there was quite a meeting that was filled with a lot of anger. And one of the things that was said at the end, like, where are we going to go from here? And someone suggested that they invite Sustainable Gabriola to set up a forum for moving forward. So people that were at that forum, at that initial meeting, did hear that. Then we just, our local paper is great. There was an article in the paper about it and the idea that people could come and actually put forward their ideas. I think on the island, and I think this is actually true most places, people there's lots of opinions. And so people want to come forward and bring their opinions to the table. And so that's something that encourages people to come if they believe there's going to be a space for their opinions to be heard. And because Sustainable Gabriola had held other meetings in which there was lots of space for people to voice their opinions, I think people were feeling this was an opportunity for them to do that. Then because those that were in conflict may not initially have wanted to come, but they wanted to come because they wanted to put forward their way of thinking. And they didn't want that to just be determined by others that weren't part of the decision. One of the things that we did was gather. There was something that the recycling depot had done, which was send out kind of a questionnaire to people, and from that we gathered what a lot of the comments were ahead of time, and so we set up the different meetings in such a way that people saw what their concerns were at the different tables that they could have conversations about. So there was a conversation about volunteers, and there was also a wild card table. So if you had something that you didn't feel was addressed in one of the other tables, then you could go to that table and have a conversation. So what we focused on was saying this is about moving forward. This is not about arguing about what has happened in the past and who's to blame. Everything that needs to be said needs to be about how do we move forward on this. And so that takes away the opportunity for the battle to happen. And it really did kind of end up being something that people walked out of there feeling, wow, we've actually got some forward ways of moving. And some of the anger was decreased a lot. Fortunately, the gyro board did take some of those actions and recommendations that people came up with and started trying to implement them, which also made the difference, because there's no point in having a conversation and people putting forward their ideas and recommendations if no one's going to follow through on them. So I think I'd answer. Is that good? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Dave. I'm Carol.
Hi there. Hi, Carol.
A quick questioning about your visioning process, and are you planning in terms of a progression? You did a visioning process to sort of develop the strategy towards moving forward. I guess I'm asking the question specifically, how long is that vision? How many years are you going to do that again, in terms of a cycle? Or do you look at it on a yearly basis, or is it only on, like, think of Mao Zedong and his 5-year strategies? Is there a time window, or have you established that in terms of Sustainable Gabriola, or in terms of the way your committee and your group is working?
So are you talking about the recent visioning session that we did last in the spring?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry,
okay.
Yeah. So,
Right. So
Yeah.
how long? It's a good question, because what we had done is we had done one back in 2000. It was quite a long time. I think it was 8 years or something between the one we'd initially done, and then this one that we held back in the spring. And it wasn't so much as um, a decision, yes, it will be 5 years. I think what happened is there started to be a conversation at the Sustainable Gabriola meetings about, wow, isn't this exciting? We've actually done a lot of the stuff that was in that initial plan. And, where are we going next? And so I think it really came out of the discussion itself at the Sustainable Gabriola meeting, around where to go.
So as you've changed,
Yes,
and communities are constantly changing. It's never stagnant. So
exactly.
you've introduced different things, whether it's the abattoir or you've got vegan groups. But as you bring new people into a community, you start to develop new ideas. Is that encouraged, or do you feel that there's an open door so you can do this again, like you're visioning? I look for a vision quest. Do you look at it that way, or is it you don't have a strategy?
So I think that ideas are welcome throughout the whole time period, so it's always changing. During that time period, there were a number of things that came up at the original visioning session that were done, but there were also, like you say, a whole pile of other things that occurred and happened, and they're always welcomed. And I don't think that a visioning session necessarily would ever stop those kinds of things from happening. It isn't about what was in the original vision. It's actually about people bringing ideas to the table and saying, what about this? We had a woman move from Bowen Island, and she had been doing fix-it fairs on Bowen Island. And so she brought that to the Sustainable Gabriola thing, and all of a sudden now we've had several fix-it fairs. And it wasn't about the original vision, except that the original vision was about ways of thinking and ways of kind of moving forward and broader, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and becoming more sustainable in terms of our being able to fix things, not throw things away, etc. So the goals were always there. It's just a whole pile of different ideas can come up.
Right.
A visioning session sometimes only is about bringing more ideas up, or and bringing more people into the conversation.
Thank you.
Okay.
Anybody else? Questions, examples? Great.
Hi, Faye. I'm Nicole. Nice to meet you.
Hi. Good to meet you.
So I'm kind of curious as to what the percentage of people on Gabriola have this similar kind of sustainable, self-sufficient mindset. Is it everyone? Is there kind of, I'm just curious as to kind of trying to envision it in my mind.
It is definitely not everyone. I think that there's probably the majority. I can't remember if it's on the Sustainable Gabriola website or not, but we did a well-being survey. We had actually a fellow that worked on Bhutan's happiness indicators worked with us to develop the different indicators, and we looked at things like if you had the opportunity to either grow your own food or buy local organic food, or not, what would you do? How much of the time would you do that? And there was I think it was like 70% kind of did it most or all the time. So, and when we took a look at the statistics and I'm trying to think of what the term is now, it was the margin of error was very small. It was actually a really good statistical sample, and so that probably gives us a good sense.
Did you, how high was the percentage of participation for the survey? Was it, because I know sometimes surveys are pretty low. I'm just curious, was it,
I think we had 400 people for our population of 4,000, so.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty.
Yeah, and when you think about kids and so on not being included, you know, they're part of the 4,000, but they're not part of it. Yeah.
And then I have another question. I'm just, it's kind of a curious thing. Is there anybody that kind of, like I was reading briefly, scanning the websites, and I noticed you guys do like a heat pump initiative, and there's other initiatives like that. Is there someone who tracks kind of before and after, and to see if there's any changes in like your ecological footprint or anything like that? Like, is there anyone kind of studying the changes, or is it just based on maybe happiness of the residents?
Okay. There's not, with respect to the heat pumps, we know that there's now over 500 heat pumps, which is going to make a difference. Yeah. Yeah, but there, several of us did a greenhouse gas emission inventory in 2010, I believe it was. So what we were tracking was transportation and fuel use. So it was specific to greenhouse gas emissions, but we captured things like waste, what proportion, and were we changing over time. There hasn't been a follow-up study done yet. Again, it was volunteers that did that, and some of the authors are talking about doing it again because I think it would be really interesting to see.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Okay, I had another question.
Okay, good.
It builds on the topic of population that you had just said. And reading through the website, there was an indicator in your community sustainability plan, and it was that the dominant demographic was retired people.
Yes.
And so there was a follow-up to that note that there was a need to bring young families into the community. And so I'm wondering what that looks like, how you did that, and what successes you've had.
Okay, that's a good question. What we did was we actually had someone who provided one of the local papers provided some funds to have a youth forum, and by youth we were talking 20 and 30-year-olds, and we had, I think, 5 people in their 20s that organized it, and it was about work on the island, etc. And what they did is the first part of the forum was about young people on the island that have jobs, and they talked about what kind of work they did and the extent to which they initiated their own. Many of them started their own businesses, as well as people who were doing 6 different things, as well as the idea that it costs a lot less to live on Gabriola. And so then we went into groups to talk about how do we encourage more people to come on. And so out of that, there were a number of different ideas put forward. I mean, affordable housing is a key one, and there aren't many options on Gabriola because it's mostly single-family residences as opposed to townhouses or anything. The success, that's an interesting question because the average age on the island is getting older still. It's not getting younger, but the elementary school has got more kids in it this last year and the year before that. So, and the forum was held probably 3 years ago. So what we're noticing is that it does feel like there's some more families arriving on the island. One of the strategies that people put forward was the idea that of encouraging people who were able to stay on the island, but work across the country, work across the province or whatever. We've got one person that arrived about 3 or 4 years ago that does patent graphics, and he does it for companies across Canada, and he's now got a staff of about 5 people. And he himself is probably 40, and he's now got 3 young kids. So it's happening. I think it's a challenge when there's so many people that are retired that are moving here too. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Last chance for comments, questions, examples from your community, questions of whether things would work. Good
Yeah,
for
it would
now.
be really great to hear from some of you as to some of the initiatives that you're working on that might be similar. Okay.
I can share one.
Yeah, come on up.
I know it's the speed. Hi, Faye.
Cool.
Number
Hi.
one speaker.
Good to see you.
I see you. Thanks for that. I mentioned I work for a small nonprofit, and to increase local food production, we get grants in every year to offer free soil testing for people's front yards and boulevards so that they can expand their food production if they wish to do that. And City of Victoria has been really supportive about that, so we haven't had any pushback from the government. So it's something that's working really well and going into our 4th year because it's sort of practical, but it starts with the most important thing, the soil, and building people's understanding around that.
That's great. That's cool. And that's something that then others in your group hear and they say, gee, maybe I could try that in my community. Right? Any other ideas that people are working on that they'd like to share?
Yeah, this one coming up.
Okay.
So we partner with I manage a landfill recycling and composting facility. We partner with a nonprofit. Basically, we situate them on our site so that before they come onto the site to drop off waste, they can go to this nonprofit organization that takes reusable materials for free. So they basically, if it's clothing, if it's shoes, kids' toys, whatever it might be, they'll take it for free from the people, and then they sell it for kind of garage sale prices back to other people in the community. And so this has grown so fast in the last even just 5 years since I've been working with them, that they're now making over $700,000 a year in revenue just by selling stuff that otherwise would have gone into the landfill. And then they've created this huge network throughout the communities that if even companies have something that's reusable, instead of sending it to auction, they'll just call these guys to come pick it up, and then they try and find a home for it or someone who can make use of it. So that's been a huge success, and we have people from across Canada come to tour the site and see what it is they're doing there. But there's a very particular model that seems to work, and other communities have tried to do it like through the municipality, and it doesn't work. You have to have that blend of nonprofits, volunteerism. It seems to make it work much better because some cities have tried to have full paid staff run it, and even some of them charge people to drop off, small amounts, but still there's a charge, and it just doesn't work. Whereas the model that this nonprofit has developed seems to work really well.
Cool. What is the name of the nonprofit?
It's called the Foothills Salvage and Recycling Society.
Cool.
Yeah,
that sounds great, actually. Yeah.
It's kind of
I'd like to know more about that. Thank you. That's great.
Me again. I'm working with 2 people from Vancouver, and I'm trying to get them to come to Surrey and expand their ideas. So one of them is they're both about upcycling or and reusing. So because my big thing is always people say like, oh, I recycle, I do my part, and I try to think like, but it's reduce, reuse, recycle. Like the recycling is sort of the last thing, so the bare minimum you should be doing. And not that I want to shoot people, but if I were to shoot people, essentially one of them is all about textile, and one of them is all about technology. So what they do is these repair cafes, and they have a little mobile that comes to places, and they're trying to find a permanent home. And that's what I'm also trying to help with, and some funding as well. But essentially, they want to educate people on what else to do instead of throwing things away. And it's not just like you bring it and they repair it for you, but they actually teach you how to do it yourself, so that in the future you can help yourself a little bit and try to spread that knowledge. And the technology one is it's really started with me being like, I hate how I buy something and a year later it breaks and I don't know what to do with it, and it tells me do not open, like electric shock or whatever, and I'm like, but I want to open it and I want to know how to fix it. So that's kind of like why I contact these people, and I try to expand sort of what they're doing. And that's I'll know the outcome of that in November, but that's the current one.
That's great. Yeah, it's amazing how many things that we buy that break so easily. When we had the first Fix-It fair, people were bringing in suitcases and all kinds of things just because the wheel had fallen off, right? And the fixers had a great time fixing this stuff. Anyone else?
It sounds like people are winding down, but I wouldn't be surprised if they'll have some things to share with you later, or
That
some
would be
things.
great.
Yeah. So
Okay.
just going to add a couple of things to reinforce things you've said, Faye. One is that I think all the stories you've heard from Faye are about people coming together face to face in the community, which is so important for a number of reasons. Like, I think there are good tools being developed and used now for public participation at a distance. They've improved a lot, although they're not well known yet. But on the flip side, there's nothing more divisive than the Gabriola Facebook sites when some topic comes up about, several things you've mentioned. It's just kind of the worst of public interaction. So the online stuff, I think, is a last resort and needs to be done very well. So I really admire the work you're doing, Faye, and others are, because it's not only a way of moving ahead with sustainability, it's also a way of connecting people who may know 50 people on the island, but they'd love to know 200 people or 500 people on the island. And the properties are larger than a city property. And so it's a wonderful double benefit when these things happen well. And the other thing I was going to say, and I'm curious about your reaction to this, Faye, I sometimes sort of joke in my own mind about how when newcomers come to the island, it would be really interesting to have you can't move here until you have this indoctrination. One of my life-changing moments, maybe that's a bit too big a term, but Gabriola life-changing moments was Judith Plant's presentation at the Haven about New Society Publishers.
Yeah.
We all know, well, maybe newcomers don't even know it's there, but I heard for maybe an hour, she spoke at least, I think, about how that evolved, how it came to be, what the philosophical roots were, how it came to be a Gabriola thing. I had people sitting beside me saying, yeah, that's why we came to Gabriola. It was because of that movement, that set of skills, that coalescing that happened on the island. And I think with the number of people at that event, there were probably lots of newcomers and a real cross section of people, but I don't see much of that happening. I don't know if it was as powerful for others as it was for me, but it just gave me this sense of another layer of how special the place is, how special the people are, what the possibilities are. And it's a shame when those things aren't known. So I don't know what you think about that sort of thing, Faye, but I think it could be developed a lot more.
And you're thinking developed a lot more in terms of having more sessions like that around
interesting.
Why people move. Yeah,
sort of what is Gabriola disguised as a presentation about, New Society
Exactly.
Publishing or whatever. Yeah.
Actually, that would be a great idea. Like, even the young fellow I talked about that does the graphic patent stuff, and his wife is Lynn Bowerman, who's an organic farmer, and just to have them get up and talk a bit about what they do would be amazing, right? It's kind of this breadth of experience and new people that are doing amazing stuff. So yeah.
So I want to, on behalf of all the folks here, thank you very, very much for joining us. I know you have a busy life, and I think there are lots of seeds of ideas here that are heading out to different parts of the country and the world, because we're international here today. So thank you.
Well, I'd love to hear some of those ideas that people had mentioned. If you can send me emails about that stuff, I'd love to know more. That's cool. Okay. Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
Okay. Bye.